Cold has ended more campaigns than bullets ever did. And long before electric heaters or high-tech sleeping bags, soldiers survived brutal winters with nothing but fabric, air, and discipline. One forgotten blanket setup quietly kept thousands alive when temperatures dropped low enough to kill in just a few hours. No magic, no myths, just smart layering, physics, and, hard-earned experience. Here's the part most people miss. Soldiers didn't just bundle up. They used blankets in a specific, almost ritualized way that trapped heat, blocked wind, and managed moisture. When done right, it meant the difference between waking up ready to march and honestly never waking up at all. Let's break down how it worked and why it still matters today. Throughout history, armies feared winter almost as much as their enemies. From Napoleon's retreat from Moscow to trench warfare in World War II, freezing temperatures crippled fighting forces. Frostbite, hypothermia, and illness spread faster than any opposing army. Gear was limited. Supplies were rationed. Soldiers couldn't rely on constant fires or heated shelters. Blankets were among the most valuable items a soldier owned, not because they were thick or luxurious, but because they were versatile. Wool blankets in particular became standard issue in many armies by the 19th and early 20th centuries. Wool stayed warm when damp, resisted sparks, and lasted for years of abuse. But the real secret wasn't the blanket itself. It was how soldiers used it. The layering principle most people get wrong. Modern thinking often says thicker is better. Soldiers learned the opposite. Trapped air was the true insulator. The forgotten blanket setup focused on creating layers of air, not crushing them. Instead of wrapping tightly like a cocoon, soldiers used a loose but structured wrap. One blanket went directly over the body, but not tight. Another went over that, offset slightly to break wind flow. In some cases, a third layer, often a shelter half, ground sheet, or even spare clothing, was added on top. Each layer created pockets of still air. Still air holds heat. Compression kills warmth. Here's the clever part. Soldiers were trained to avoid tucking everything in too tightly. Loose folds mattered. Overlapping edges mattered. Even small gaps, if placed correctly, prevented wind from cutting straight through. The ground was more dangerous than the air. One hard-learned lesson from winter campaigns was that the ground steals heat faster than cold air ever could. Sleeping directly on frozen earth could drain body heat at shocking speed. The blanket setup always started underneath. One blanket, coat, or spare fabric went between the soldier and the ground. In emergencies, pine boughs, straw, or even folded packs were added first, then the blanket. Only after insulating the ground did soldiers focus on covering the body. This single step dramatically reduced hypothermia risk. Many early military manuals stressed this, even when supplies were low. Moisture management was a matter of life and death. Here's where things get interesting. Sweat was actually deadly in winter. Marching hard, digging trenches or hauling gear caused sweating even in freezing temperatures. If that moisture stayed trapped, it would chill the body once activity stopped. The blanket setup accounted for this. Soldiers often aired blankets whenever possible, even if it was just briefly. They avoided sleeping in soaking wet clothing when conditions allowed. Some manuals even advised loosening the top layer just a bit at first, letting excess heat and moisture escape before sealing in for the night. This wasn't comfort advice, it was battlefield wisdom. A damp blanket could freeze stiff overnight, but a dry one, well, that could save your fingers. Why wool was chosen for a reason is, well, pretty straightforward. Cotton kills warmth when wet. Linen, honestly, offers little insulation. Wool, on the other hand, keeps insulating even when damp. That's why wool blankets became a military standard across Europe and North America by the late 1800s. Wool fibres trap air naturally. They repel light moisture and, dry faster than most fabrics available at the time. They also resist sparks from fires, a critical detail when soldiers slept near open flames. The burrito that wasn't a burrito. Let me explain. Many modern recreations show soldiers wrapped tightly like mummies. That's inaccurate. The forgotten setup resembled a layered envelope rather than a roll. Blankets were folded lengthwise, then draped and overlapped. The opening was often positioned away from the prevailing wind. Boots or packs were sometimes placed at the foot to block drafts. Hats stayed on. Scarves sealed the neck area loosely. This allowed movement, breathing, and temperature regulation. Soldiers could adjust layers without fully exposing themselves. Small changes made big differences through long nights. Fires were a bonus, not a requirement. Movies love roaring campfires, but reality rarely allowed them. Smoke gave away positions. Fuel was scarce. Fires were often forbidden near the front. So the blanket setup actually worked even without fire. When fires were allowed, soldiers would position themselves to reflect heat, rather than just relying on the fire's direct warmth. You see, blankets weren't really blocking heat, they were blocking the wind. With a small fire and the right kind of layering, they could create a survivable little microclimate. And, this technique could be scaled up. It worked for one man, a whole squad, or even an entire encampment. Why did this knowledge fade away? Well, modern sleeping bags came along and replaced those old blanket systems. Technology got better, materials kept evolving, but honestly, something valuable was lost in that transition. Sleeping bags are pretty great, until they get wet, damaged, or you just can't get your hands on one. The old blanket setup, though, was modular. It was adaptable. You could repair it right there in the field. And best of all, it worked with just the bare minimum of resources. As armies modernized, training moved away from fabric literacy. The skill faded. Today, most people own blankets but don't know how to use them effectively in cold survival scenarios. Why does this still matter today? Well, cold exposure hasn't changed. Physics hasn't changed. The human body hasn't changed either. So, understanding how to layer fabric, manage moisture, insulate yourself from the ground, and trap air, that remains absolutely essential. Whether you're dealing with a power outage, winter camping, or even an emergency evacuation, this kind of forgotten knowledge still works. You don't need military gear. What you really need is awareness, blankets, discipline. History already tested this setup under the worst conditions imaginable, and it passed. The real legacy of survival? This wasn't some kind of trick. It wasn't just folklore. It was practical knowledge, refined by necessity and honestly paid for in lives. Soldiers survived because they learned how to work with what they had, not because they waited around for better tools. That's the legacy worth remembering. So, if this kind of forgotten survival knowledge matters to you, if you believe old skills still have power in today's world, make sure you're part of this community. Subscribe to Legacy of Survival, like this video, and share it with someone who values real-world wisdom over gadgets. Because, the cold doesn't care what century you're in. And knowing this setup might one day keep you alive.